This is AM Agenda. Thanks for your company. Joining me now, Liberal MP Paul Fletcher and Labor MP Kelvin Thompson. Kelvin Thompson, I want to go to you first of all. The use of foreign aid funding for plugging holes in the immigration budget. The World Vision chief, Tim Costello, says that this reflects a hemorrhaging of the aid budget, that it's discouraging and damaging to our international reputation. What do you say to that?
Well, this morning's reports are the first I've seen of this issue, Kieran, and I'm a very strong supporter of the foreign aid budget. Indeed, I've been proposing for years that we lift it to the United Nations target of 0.7% of GDP. But in terms of considering this issue, I have seen this morning that the way in which this money is being spent is consistent with the OECD guidelines for foreign aid, and that indeed the United States, France and Sweden spend more money in this way than we do, and that other countries like Norway, the Netherlands and Canada spend comparable amounts. So I will be considering that as part of the issue.
But instinctively, do you feel comfortable with it?
Well, the case for it is that spending money on people who are asylum seekers here is assistance or aid in the same way as spending money on people who are asylum seekers in, for example, Jordan or Lebanon or Syria.
But you haven't answered the question as to instinctively whether you personally feel comfortable with it.
Well, I've come across it for the first time this morning, Kieran. I will be having a look at it.
Doesn't sound like you are. It doesn't sound like you are.
Well, I note that the OECD guidelines are being reported as allowing countries to spend money in this way as part of the foreign aid expenditure, which, as I said, I'm a very strong supporter of. I believe we ought to be lifting our target. I'll be having a look at it and finding out more about it.
Paul Fletcher, Kelvin Thompson makes the argument there that Foreign Minister Carr has made that this does fit within the international guidelines on foreign aid spending, that the US, Canada, France spend more in this exact same form.
Well, Kieran, let's be clear what's happening here. There's been a huge blowout in the costs of the asylum seeker program, some $6 billion in the life of this government. That's happened because of the tragically mixed messages sent by this government going back to when the Rudd government came in and comprehensively changed the successful policy of the Howard government. What we've now seen is, in a desperate scramble for more money to deal with the growing expenses of this program, the government's been caught out in a sneaky exercise of trying to reallocate money which is designated as foreign aid money. Now, what Australians would expect that money is being used to do is things like paying for new wells in villages in poor countries that don't have clean drinking water. They'd expect it to be going to things like microfinance programs, so that women in villages in very poor countries are able to buy a sewing machine or another piece of equipment that can be used to start a micro business. In other words, economic development, social development in poor countries as part of our responsibility as a wealthy Western nation to deliver foreign aid. And unfortunately what we've got is the human consequences of the mismanagement of our border protection. The cost is blown out and now money is being taken away from other worthwhile objectives.
All right,
Kieran,
let's move on. Kelvin, quickly.
Yeah, well, it's a bit steep, Kieran, for the opposition to be talking about foreign aid in this way. After all, Joe Hockey said prior to the last election that the opposition would cut $300 million from the foreign aid budget, and we've seen reports regularly of coalition dissent about cutting foreign aid to Africa or for teaching in Indonesian schools. So it's a bit rich for the opposition to be arguing or claiming to be supporters of foreign aid now.
All right, Paul Fletcher, your response quickly.
Well, Kieran, let's just look at what the government has actually done. There's a block of money.
We've increased the foreign aid budget.
There's a block of money set aside to provide for foreign aid. We all know what that should be going to, and now we have the government caught out in a sneaky exercise of shifting that money to pay for the ballooning cost of asylum seekers. We've effectively got the outsourcing of the management of our foreign aid program to the people smugglers. That is what's happening.
Let's move on. I want to get your thoughts, both of you, on developments in the United States. I'm sure you saw President Obama's comments yesterday, his speech. Kelvin Thompson, what did you make of it? Should there be any optimism at all that there will be substantive progress on combating that plague of gun culture in the United States?
Kieran, I would like every Australian to try to make contact with someone in America and say, you should be adopting Australia's gun laws. I intend to write to all the US congressmen, the senators, pointing out that Australia has had this experience. We had the Port Arthur massacre. We introduced legislation to tackle semi-automatic weapons, and as a consequence, gun deaths in Australia, whether it be homicides or suicides or accidents, have dramatically nosedived since then. Thousands of Australian lives have been saved as a consequence. The US has a gun death rate something like 300 times that of Australia. So we've been down this path. I believe the US can learn from our experience, and I want to encourage every Australian to reach out to Americans and make contact with them and say, we have been down this road and we know the way you should go.
Paul Fletcher, President Obama yesterday said in that speech, we are not doing enough and we will have to change. These tragedies must end. But do you share the general pessimism around that prospect that the United States will change, given how entrenched that gun culture is?
Well, Kieran, as Kelvin alluded to there, following the Port Arthur massacre in Australia, the Howard government took the decision to introduce a new regime effectively banning automatic and semi-automatic weapons. And the evidence suggests more than a decade on that has been demonstrably successful in reducing the rate of death from firearms, and we have not seen a repeat of these kinds of tragedies.
But it's hard to see the US doing the same thing, isn't it?
Well, the point I was going to make was that there were arguments at the time that this was a political impossibility in Australia. There were arguments at the time that this involved John Howard doing something that was not popular in some parts of Australia, including amongst supporters of the coalition. But Mr Howard took that courageous decision with the support, it must be said, of many across the community, and he rightly holds this as one of the defining achievements of his Prime Ministership. And so I hope, I agree with much of what Kelvin has said, I hope the example of what's happened in Australia can be of some value as our American friends think about how they deal with this terrible problem, and as they work to hopefully get into a position where they never again have to contribute this kind of, to contemplate this kind of awful, awful tragedy.
Kelvin, we're almost out of time, but just quickly, I saw one reference yesterday to comparing the fact that counter-terrorism, someone tries to use a shoe bomb, we all have to take our shoes off through security, and yet these tragedies just happen time and time again.
Well, that's exactly right, Kieran, and the evidence is that owning a gun doesn't make you safer. In fact, the shooter's mother was the owner of the weapon. She wasn't safer as a result. She was killed as a result. The truth is that more guns equals more violence and more deaths, and fewer guns equals a safer community.
Kelvin Thompson and Paul Fletcher, appreciate that this morning, and your efforts throughout this year with us, and all the best for Christmas and the New Year.
Have a great Christmas.
All the best for Christmas to you both.
To you too.
Thank you. That's all for AM Agenda this morning.